And then Angie, we're going to hear from you today, but do you want to give an introduction and where you're from?
I can. So Angela Gupta, University of Minnesota Extension Forester, and I am out of the Rochester office. And so, yeah, that's where I am.
Great. Well, many of you know that usually Angie is the one moderating these, but Angie is our speaker today. And so I'll be kind of moderating along with Gary's help. We'll both be typing into chat some thoughts and questions. We encourage you all to type your questions into chat as we go through today. This is Angie's presentation on jumping worms. And so before we get started, just a couple of other housekeeping things. We've got the hour, and so we'll end here at 10 o'clock Central Time. And we're kind of a big group, but we do want to know where people are from. And so in the chat, if you don't mind typing your name, where you're tuning in from this morning, and then maybe one quick thing about what you want to learn today. And so that would be helpful for us to know kind of where folks are calling from and what people are interested in learning about. A couple of other things, we do have continuing education credits as well. We have 1 credit for Society of American Foresters, if you're interested in that. And we have 1 credit for a Minnesota Forest Stewardship Program, 1 credit for that. And so I'll share those links toward the end of the meeting, along with a short evaluation to know how you thought about this webinar. And so that'll be coming near the end of today's session. We also have, because this is the last one, we've also had many of these recorded. And so I'll share in the chat a link to a YouTube playlist if you wanted to go back to watch some of the previous webinars in this session. So I'll put that in the chat as well. And then this session is being recorded. And so if you did want to watch back this session, we'll have that up on YouTube probably in the next week or so. And so have a look for it there. Great to see all the folks typing into chat where you're from. And so with that, I think that does it for the housekeeping. And Angie, I'll turn it over to you. You can go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I was trying to quickly read some of the comments, but I'm hoping Gary and Matt will facilitate those as we get towards the end. So the hope here is that I will talk about jumping worms as they specifically relate to forests for maybe about 40 minutes, and then we'll definitely do Q&A. And I have skipped bunches of stuff that is often in this presentation because forest pest first detectors know a lot about invasive species. And so I didn't feel like I needed to repeat a lot of things. So here we go. So today we're going to talk a smidge about laws and regulations, just briefly mention how to report. I expect you all know that. And then I will get into jumping worms, impacts and identification, next steps, and how to help, and policy and research update. And so jumping right into sort of where jumping worms might land in state policy, and they land in this sort of really funny unlisted non-native species category at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And I think it's easiest to think about this as the lost or abandoned pet category. So it's the same category that if you had an alligator or a snake or a parakeet, you wouldn't be allowed to release, to sell it, purchase. There are no restrictions on sales, purchase, or possession, but they cannot be introduced into a free living state. So jumping worms are functionally non-regulated. The difference is I think people don't recognize that they're releasing them into to the environment, so they sneak in, and that's the problem, of course. There is work underway to see if jumping worms can move up the regulatory scale, and I'll touch on that at the end. And so you guys should all know this, but I just want to be really clear. As with all invasive species in the state of Minnesota, we prefer that they be reported first and really primarily through EDMAP's app. That is, formerly it was Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. I want to be really clear. Both Great Lakes Early Detection Network app and EDMAPS, they all go to the EDMAPS platform. And so EDMAPS is just the newest iteration that's being introduced across all of the United States, so not specific to the Great Lakes. It's functions and acts very, very similar to Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. And Glennon still works if you have it. It eventually will be phased out. If you're really anti-cell phones and smartphones, you can, of course, submit through EDMAP's Midwest website. So that's online. And then jumping worms are a bit unique. So often at this point, I would say you could report to Arrest the Pest at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, but really for jumping worms, if you really don't like the first two choices, Laura Van Riper at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resource is the contact for jumping worms. So now I'm going to dive into worms. And so worms, we have no native earthworms in the state of Minnesota. And so that sometimes is a surprise for people. There are also no management approaches at this point that are scientifically recommended for any worms, including jumping worms. And so that is often like the fundamental problem. So all of the worms in Minnesota, all of the earthworms are invasive, and there's no way to manage them if you get them within your property or your forest. So why do they matter? So this is a great image from a paper that Lee Freilich at the university and others put out in 2019. But functionally how this works is they're ecosystem engineers. So earthworms change the soil characteristic that changes the herbaceous layer in the plants that grow in the soil. By changing the herbaceous layer in the plants, you change the herbivores that live on those plants. By changing the herbivores, you change the carnivores that live on the herbivores. And by changing those carnivores, you change the top carnivores. So these relatively inconspicuous worms really have massive changes in our ecosystem. And again, this is all worms, not specific to jumping worms. So as I suspect you all know, the definition of invasive species is a non-native species that causes environmental, economic, or human health harm. And that's the definition. So it's got to do those things. And earthworms do all of those. And so again, standard earthworms. And to be clear, when I say earthworms, there are about 16 species of earthworms that can be found in Minnesota from about 0 inches of soil depth, so at the soil surface, all the way down to about 6 feet of soil depth. And those are our normal Eurasian suite of earthworms. And I'll talk about how jumping worms is different. But this normal suite of earthworms changes the soil. They can actually increase the ragweed density, which of course increases allergens in people. They can change the tick population, which of course is a vector for Lyme disease. We know that the soil changes can reduce or increase the amount of bare mineral soil, which makes those soils more conducive for things like buckthorn, which is the overwintering host for soybean aphid, which is now Minnesota's single largest pest on soybeans. So then soybean growers put a lot of energy into managing soybean aphids. Asian lady beetles were introduced as a biocontrol for soybean aphids, and then they also increase allergens. So it gets to be really complicated really quick. Soybean aphids, of course, reduce crop productivity, which is why there's such a big impact, and that has economic impacts. This composition soil change changes the nutrients, which decreases forest productivity, crop productivity. And the changes in soil type also change forest and drought regimes, which can decrease forest biodiversity. So again, relatively inconspicuous, easy to miss earthworms create all of these negative impacts. And it really is very complicated. So then, and maybe if Gary or Matt want to, there's a great video that we put together a few years called Tangled Ecosystem, and I'm not going to play it today, but it does outline just how complicated these invasive species loops are. And if anyone wants to drop that link into the chat, that would be great. Tangled Ecosystem. It's a YouTube video by the University of Minnesota Extension. So this is what the soil profiles would look like in a forest when those standard suite of earthworms starts to move in. And so on the left, you have a forest herbaceous layer that's healthy. You have a diversity of native species. And then you have a soil horizon, which has leaves that are not decomposed, leaves that are partially decomposed, leaves that are slowly decomposing into soil. You've got sort of beautiful black dirt, and then you have that bottom soil layer. When you get earthworms invade into a stand, that all changes. So you lose that herbaceous layer, and it really becomes devoid of a lot of your native understory. Then you can sometimes have a robust sort of solid leaf layer in the fall, but even by the next late summer before leaf fall, you might have almost no leaves left on that site. They will all have been eaten and then quickly decomposed by the earthworms. And so you don't see that mixing of partially decomposed leaves. That's because the earthworms eat it and they poop out frass, and that is a very different consistency. And so it essentially drastically speeds up the rate of forest leaf decomposition. And then you get very few of these soil horizons until you get down to that bare mineral soil. And so that is the sort of the standard impact of our forests. And as I said, there are no ways in which we can manage jumping worms. So it's just prevention. And that is a problem. So here's one last image of this. So no earthworms at all. You have those multiple layers, different layers of decomposition. You have this really healthy herbaceous native understory. And then here you have earthworms, and you have maybe that leaf layer early in the season. It will start to go away, and you have very little mixing, and you have very few native understory plants in the wake of an earthworm invasion. And so this has those cascading impacts, right? So we have a loss of native plant diversity. It can become hard to regenerate native trees. Some of the best research is around the negative impact of sugar maple regeneration. And so sugar maple seedlings, it turns out, need that mixed forest layer of leaves and slowly decomposing leaves that just become absent in an earthworm invasion. And then things like buckthorn really do very, very well in that bare mineral soil that is also as a result of buckthorn. So now you get a positive feedback loop for one invasive species, enabling an ecosystem to be better to invade by another. And all of that is working against some of our native species. That, of course, then leads to a loss of habitat for several ground nesting bird species, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and small mammals. So now we're going to talk about jumping worms. And so I think I'm going to keep going unless there are any pressing questions about earthworms generally.
Angie, there was one, you might be getting to this, but Tom Harris was asking. So Tom is a volunteer with Three Rivers Parks. He has a known site. He wants to do a survey to see if they are spreading. Would late June be late enough to do it?
Yeah, so if late June would not be late enough to do it, and I'll get to that when I get a little bit further, but essentially we will not identify jumping worms confidently until late July, until they are fully adults. And so I will talk about that in a moment, but it's a great question. So this is the EdMaps map for jumping worms in the state of Minnesota. And often when you see me present maps, I do point maps. You can see individual points in the landscape that have confirmed invasive species. But with jumping worms, I'm showing you here a density map by county. And the reason is that some homeowners are very anxious to have their homes attributed with earthworms. And so they won't give us permission to show their record to a point. And so what they are willing to give us permission to do is to show that their record is within the county, right? And so this is the most accurate data in the state, is this county level in jumping worm density. And so you can see that the metro area has mostly 100 to 500 jumping worms, or 11 to 100 per county. So of course, that doesn't mean that there are jumping worms everywhere in the county, right? And it's really hard to know where within the county. And the flip side to that is if you go down to Winona or Houston counties, there is only one confirmed jumping worm in those counties, even though the counties themselves appear to be green. So just sort of know that. But it is a very sensitive subject for some home and landowners. And so that is why we protect that data that way. If I were to zoom out on this map and you were to see it at a national level, it looks as if Minnesota has like a huge infestation of jumping worms. And I'll tell you right now, I think we are much better at tracking them and reporting them than some of our neighbors. It turns out jumping worms are not universally reported in other invasive species platforms and in other states. And so the data is very unclear about their distribution and density outside of Minnesota. All right. So now I'm going to jump into some relatively new research that I learned during an invasive species or a jumping worm symposium back in January. And I, of course, am concentrating on the woods part of that. But this is some great information from Anise Dobson out of the Yale School of the Environment. And she really looked at plant diversity and jumping worms, so very specific to jumping worms. And what she noticed is the native richness of a site decreases as jumping worms move into that stand. So bad news for our native species. And then the converse of that is she was able to record that invasive species richness, so the density and species diversity of invasive plants went up when jumping worms move into a stand. So again, we're seeing that positive feedback loop from one invasive species jumping worm to other invasive species. And then this is maybe what I found to be her most discouraging finding. So she's out east. Jumping worms have been out east for a really long time, but jumping worm research has not typically been well funded. So even though it's been there for many decades, we don't know a ton about it. And now it frankly sounds like they're stumbling across jumping worms so often that many of their research projects sort of get converted into jumping worms because they can't essentially do their primary research project. And so Anise did this research, and they have a big problem with the deer herd in New England, very much like we do in Minnesota. And so that they know that some species really struggle to reproduce and thrive in an overbrowsed ecosystem. But those species, those native understory herbaceous species, tend to persist. They just don't thrive. They maybe won't have so many. However, when you get earthworms that move, or jumping worms move into these same sites where these species have been persisting but not thriving, then these native understory species actually go away. And so they become extirpated from the site. And that is very concerning, because I would say we don't in Minnesota have a great handle on our deer herd, and there are still no managements for jumping worms. So this is very concerning. So some other research from that same symposium, this is by Justin Richardson at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is a soil scientist. And again, it felt like several of his research projects related to soil were just getting hijacked by jumping worms. So in Poughkeepsie, New York, he was really trying to figure out where jumping worms were present in this landscape and where they might not be. And what he found is they're essentially present everywhere there are trees. And so forested areas around golf courses, wooded landscapes around home and apartments, trees around businesses, even highly developed parking lots, he was able to find jumping worms, and woods near farms and agricultural fields. So not good news, but it does help understand their potential scope. And then he also talked a fair bit about bioaccumulation, which was something I did not realize happened in worms. So if you're unfamiliar with bioaccumulation, it's the accumulation over time of a substance, and especially a contaminant, such as pesticides or heavy metals, in a living organism. And it turns out that worms can bioaccumulate. And so I want to be really, really, really clear. Worms will only bioaccumulate heavy metals, is really what we're going to talk about, if there are already heavy metals in the soil. So if you live in an area that doesn't already have contaminated soil, then your worms cannot bioaccumulate those contaminants. But if you live in an area that has contamination, then you should worry about bioaccumulation. And so what happens is that there may be harmful, the bioaccumulation itself in jumping worms, in worms, can be harmful enough to wildlife and domestic animals, and we're really talking chickens, that to eat these worms, that humans that eat the eggs from the birds, so again, think chickens, that have consumed these contaminated jumping worms, can be hazardous to human health. So that wasn't on my radar at all. And so I just want to mention that. I also want to say the worms can bioaccumulate enough to cause problem in wildlife, but we don't exactly know what that might, the impacts the wildlife might be. And so this same research from Richardson, published in a 2020 paper, these are the metals that were found to bioaccumulate in worms. So lead, copper, nickel, and arsenic. And they can be in worms, jumping worms, or earthworms generally, and in jumping worms. And so I just wanted, this really caught me off guard, I'll be frank. And so I then reached out locally to figure out, well, how can I know if my soil is contaminated? And there are two ways. If you're in town, which so maybe not really related to the forest, there's something called What's in My Neighborhood by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And of course, anyone, a farm, forest, or a residential, can get a University of Minnesota soil testing laboratory, and that will test for copper and lead. So I'm going to quickly just talk through that. So this is What's in My Neighborhood, and this is my house right here. So this is the website MPCA, that's my house. And so good for me, I don't have any records of facilities that would have led to biocontamination in my immediate backyard. But I will say that I had no idea that there was a Johnson Auto Sport in my neighborhood, and my kids regularly play at that house, and that family has a small kitchen garden. And so I really need to reach out to them and let them know that there is a chance that there may be some contaminants on their site. They don't have chickens, so in that way, it doesn't really matter from a bioaccumulation perspective. And I don't know that they have a ton of wild birds there. But this is an interesting way to figure out if your specific location might have issues or concerns. And then, of course, you can do a soil sample. So I did this for jumping worm research last fall. This is from my yard. I've had jumping worms since 2018 in my yard. And so I did the lawn and garden landscape, but there's also a farm. And I, at the time, did not know that I should have paid extra for the bioaccumulation testing for that copper and lead. So I didn't, but it's a pretty painless test. You gather up soil samples, you send them in, and very quickly they get your results. And I think it's about $17 a test, and then a little bit more for those extra bioaccumulation tests. All right, so back to jumping worm impacts. So these are the things that people really notice when they first find they have jumping worms. So things to look for. Often people report drastically changed soils that look a lot like coffee grounds. And you can see the soil becomes very granular and a little bit hard. And it also jumping worms can kill plants. This is most commonly reported with hostas, so shallow rooted plants, and you see the soil characteristic. And the jumping worms, they do appear to eat the roots and the fine roots. Then we also get reports of increased erosion. So this very granular soil doesn't stay put very well. So when there are episodes of heavy rain, it does move, and it can become hard to grow plants. So I haven't said this, so I want to be clear about it now. So jumping worms only live in the first 4 or 5 inches of soil. So when I talked about before that our suite of earthworms, so 4 or 5 inches is probably closer to that, but our suite of regular invasive earthworms in Minnesota resides from 0 inches to about 6 feet into the soil horizon. And jumping worms reside in that first 5 or 6 inches of soil only. And for reasons that were not entirely clear, when jumping worms move into a stand, all other worms appear to disappear. So you lose the worms lower in the soil horizon. And then the density of total worms can double or even triple when jumping worms move in. So let's say, for example, in a 1 foot by 1 foot area, if you had done a mustard drench as a kind of survey that you can use to survey for worms of all sorts, and you do that, and you have the normal suite of earthworms, let's say you might get 20 earthworms, and that would be a lot of earthworms, frankly, in that once jumping worms move in, you could get 40 worms in that same 1 by 1 foot area, and now they're all in the very top. And that is often how they seem to cause so much problems. They're doing all of their feeding and all of their survival in that top area, and they have these really high density of worms in a large infestation. So here's some worm identification. So jumping worms are very similar in size to our standard night crawler. So this is the kind of the worm that you might see on your sidewalk after a rain, or you might use for fishing bait. And there are a couple of key differences though. The clitellum on the jumping worm here and the night crawler here is really a primary difference. So the clitellum on a jumping worm is flush to the body, tends to be a light color, and it is only about 11 to 13 segments from the head. So that is like the single most important characteristic. Conversely, in night crawlers, the clitellum is, we call it a saddle-like clitellum. So it is raised on the top and the sides like a horse's saddle. It's flat on the tummy. It tends to be a similar color as the worm, but very, very importantly, it is much further down the worm from the head. And so none of the researchers in the state of Minnesota will confirm jumping worms until they're sexually mature and this clitellum has developed. That is typically late July in Minnesota. So, I've had a few people report that they think jumping worms hatched a couple of weeks ago when it got warm. It is possible, but no one will identify hatchlings. Any large worm this time of year is it is not going to be the standard jumping worm we have in Minnesota. And I'll get to that when I get to life cycle. But it can be really frustrating for people in spring and early summer that want to know if they have jumping worms, and we simply will not confirm them until they reach sexual maturity and have this clitellum visible. And that is typically late July. It depends a little on the weather, but that's the earliest we've seen it. So I am going to play this video. I don't think I turn on the sound. It doesn't matter. It's just worm wiggling. It's about a minute, 30 seconds. I can't remember video. And this is really what most people find so startling and so noticeable is the movement of a jumping worm. Oh, geez, that did not start. Let's go back. Ooh. All right, let's try again. Here we go. And so when you startle them, like soaking in your soil or adding compost or planting plants or weeding, they can get very lively very quick. And their movement reminds me of a snake. It's that side to side wiggle. They also feel a little sturdier to me. They're not quite as floppy as a standard night crawler, in my opinion. But if you have worms that behave this way, a red flag should go off and you should look really closely for that clitellum. And I want to be clear that we need a good high quality photo of the clitellum and the worm in order to make a positive identification. So with all identification photos, a couple of them, different angles, maybe a ruler or something for scale can be helpful, but we're really looking for that clitellum. And so I mentioned the life cycle, and I will state again, this really influences spread. So let's see, I'll start in spring. We're in spring. So this is my spring image. In the spring, as the world starts to leaf out and turn green, the eggs that have overwintered will hatch in jumping worms. And so the species that we have commonly in Minnesota, they do not survive our winter as adults. So it's only these eggs that hatch in spring, and you have hatchlings that are very small. They're frankly clear, they're tiny, and they do wiggle a lot, but they are not clearly identifiable. It turns out lots of worms are small and clear when they're young. And so they persist in commonly in edges, mulched areas, but it turns out also in some turfed areas. And then throughout the growing season, they will eventually reach this as a mature worm. You can see the clitellum here. And again, by late July, we can often identify these worms as mature jumping worms. And you can see how close that clitellum is to the head. And then this is when the worm becomes sexually mature. We believe that each jumping worm can produce up to about 30 eggs in its life. We think that jumping worms may be able to have 2 to 3 generations between late July and our freeze in the fall. And of course, that depends on how early the fall comes and the weather in Minnesota, yada, yada, yada. But that's what we think. Unfortunately, jumping worms can reproduce sexually or asexually, so they don't actually need a partner in order to reproduce, which means that, in a really bummer scenario, you could have one egg get to a site and create an infestation. And then, kind of to make matters worse, that those eggs, these are the eggs, there are mostly one species up to maybe 3 species in Minnesota. The egg size varies a little bit from maybe as big as a poppy seed to a peppercorn. So pretty small, relatively inconspicuous, frankly, look a lot like soil. And so by fall, the landscape may have quite a number of seeds from 1 to 3 generations of adult worms that are all persisting in those upper couple of inches of soil. And so when you and I and all of the good neighbors of the world in Minnesota rake our leaves, we can inadvertently move those eggs around. Maybe even adult worms, but I think eggs is what we are most concerned about in fall leaves. And so when we take our leaves to the local municipal yard waste site and leave them, again, we could inadvertently be introducing jumping worms via eggs at that point. Then late in the winter or fall, we believe jumping worms, the adults have to physically freeze. So we think it's when the soil finally freezes that the jumping worms die. We're not 100% certain. I will say my observation is they tend to get really sluggish the colder it gets, but eventually at some point in the winter, they freeze and they die. And then just these cocoons overwinter and they persist until spring, and then we repeat. So this is a bit about the pathway. This is my house. And these are the many ways in which jumping worms could have arrived. I have my suspicions, but it turns out jumping worms are a bit unique and they can actually survive in wood chips, in store-bought bagged wood chips, in wood chips from your local yard waste site, in wood chips that may be piled around town because EAB has ravaged your ash trees and they're just giving wood chips away. So they can certainly survive in wood chips. And frankly, it had been a couple of years where I had been noticing that my wood chips were disappearing at shockingly high rates, and I couldn't figure out where they were going. And then in 2018, I discovered I had jumping worms, and I realized, I think retrospectively, that the jumping worms were eating my wood chips. And this is why I kept having to add more and more to my yard. I regularly buy plants at the farmer's market. Anytime I bring soil or plants onto my property, I could inadvertently be introducing either worms or their eggs. Similarly, occasionally my boys like to fish. I will be honest, as an invasive species specialist, we do not buy live bait. They have to fish with the fake stuff, or they have to collect on site under rocks and logs. But we do know that jumping worms have been included in live bait, and we think it's a mistake. We don't think anyone's really trying to sell. It's usually night crawlers that you buy, but it turns out the vast majority of the world cannot identify worms, and so they just get caught up in sales by accident. Similarly, here's a tomato plant in my edging. I bought that at the farmer's market, and as before, anything that comes onto the property could be suspect. And then here is my now virtually debunked compost. So I didn't do a great job of managing it before, but now that I have jumping worms, I truly don't know what to do with it. And for years, I had been purchasing very inexpensive municipal compost for my local yard waste site. And to be really frank, I think that's how I got jumping worms. So I want to give good credit to Olmsted County Waste Energy. They have done a great deal to manage their yard waste site, but only a few weeks before I discovered jumping worms at my house, they were found and confirmed at the Olmsted County yard waste site, which is where I had for years gotten my compost. And they've done a really nice job doing outreach, and they've done a lot. This pile is completely moved to a different area to try to mitigate the risk of spread. They do a nice job of trying to get their temperatures high enough, but it is really important to recognize that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency regulates yard waste sites differently than compost sites in Minnesota. And yard waste sites are very common. Many counties and communities in Minnesota have yard waste sites. Compost sites are much rarer, and they tend to be just for kitchen food waste. But the reason it matters is that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency strictly regulates the temperatures at which compost sites get to, and it does not strictly regulate the temperatures at what yard waste site gets to. And we know that jumping worms and their eggs die between 120 and 130 degrees, even lower for longer periods of time. But because yard waste sites are not strictly regulated, it's unclear that those sites are getting to those temperatures consistently and throughout the site enough to kill jumping worms and their eggs. So now I want to just take a deep breath. And if you have jumping worms, or if you know someone that has jumping worms, first, just know you're not alone. Take precautions to avoid spreading them. Remove and destroy jumping worms. Really, you put them in the trash. You can put them in a Ziploc baggie or a can. You can, drown them in water, or you can just throw them into the trash, but that's how you get rid of them. Experiment. I'll talk a little bit more about the citizen science, community science project we've done, but I've had jumping worms for now, this will be 4 years, and I still have a yard, and I still have plants, and I still garden. So the world has not ended, but it has changed. So try out a variety of plants, consider alternative landscaping, keep a log, and share your successes with other gardeners. We are all learning when it comes to jumping worms, and then spread the word. So at this point, prevention is still the best cure and is the only cure for forested landscapes. We have a little more hope for urban yards, and follow the research. So I want to talk a little bit for volunteers in citizen science, actively look for and identify worms. Like, this seems kind of weird, but I never walk by a worm without looking at it at this point. And then just report through the EdMaps app if you find a jumping worm. And then I will say, if you have jumping worms, and only if you have jumping worms, I would invite you to join our jumping worm report management project. Again, I'll talk about this in a moment, but this is a project for people that have jumping worms that are willing to tell me what they're doing, and we can learn together. And so I also want to say there's a fair bit of research happening. So University of Wisconsin-Madison has a research project underway. The University of Minnesota, the MITPIC, Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plant and Pest Center, has funded Lee Freilich and others to do a research project on jumping worms. I was actually out on Friday doing soil samples with the University of Minnesota Rochester. They're going to do some DNA assays on soil to see if we can identify some characteristic differences between jumping worm infested yards without jumping worms, and prairies. Prairies have never been confirmed to have jumping worms, and we don't know why, but it is an interesting phenomenon. And then I want to say that the Minnesota Invasive Species Advisory Council has repeatedly and will continue to reach out to the Pollution Control Agency in an effort to increase regulation, or to make more transparency about regulation, so people can be more informed when they use products from yard waste sites particularly. And so this is a picture of an aerial photo of the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and these little dots, which you can't read, and that's totally fine, but these are jumping worm research sites that Lee Freilich and his team is working on. And so they're monitoring earthworms and their abundance. They're monitoring the soil horizon thickness and mass over the seasons. They're monitoring soil temperatures and collecting soil samples for bulk density and some chemical analysis of those soils to try to understand what's happening when jumping worms are present or not present in a site. So now I'm circling back to this DNR effort to potentially move jumping worms to the prohibited invasive species list instead of the unregulated. And so this is a DNR planning process, and it's a rule that would reclassify jumping worms as a prohibited invasive species. This rulemaking process, however, requires public input. And so I have committed to reach out to extension audiences like Pest First Detector, master gardeners, and master naturalists when it is time to engage in that process. But we expect that because jumping worms can be found in soil, sod, compost, mulch, plants, that there will be a lot of people that have, very passionate opinions about whether these should be more regulated or less. And as you can maybe imagine, the green industry, this would be a lot of products to regulate. So we do not anticipate they'll be super keen to see jumping worms move up the list of regulations. The flip side, if you've ever dealt with a homeowner who is deeply remorseful that they've discovered jumping worms and potentially crying, they might be very passionate that they should be more regulated. So we expect this to be kind of a hopping debate. So to reiterate, what we are still saying is there are no research-based management options for worms, including jumping worms. And I want to be really clear that chemicals in particular are regulated. So pesticide is regulated by the EPA. So a pesticide cannot be used in the United States until the EPA has decided it can be. And at that point, then the states get to weigh in. So the states then can decide if a pesticide allowed by the EPA is allowed in the state. And there are no vermiculture, there are no pesticides that manage worms regulated by the EPA, and subsequently none by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Similarly, fertilizers, and I'm sharing this because if you were to Google jumping worm management, things show up. And I don't want people running around breaking the law. But fertilizers are regulated for soil amendments, not for jumping worms, and they are regulated by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So if you're using a fertilizer as the label recommends to fertilize your yard and garden, and it happens to kill jumping worms, that is delightful, and we would love to hear about it, but you're not permitted to use the fertilizer to kill the jumping worms. It has to be a byproduct. Having said all of that, I want to just say that this citizen science, I'm actually calling it a community science project because I think it has morphed into what the community needed and not necessarily what researchers were demanding. And those aren't mutually exclusive things, but they are different. And so the unique value proposition for this project in 2021 was different than that of 2022, but it included provide emotional support to landowners impacted by jumping worms and to gather data from landowners on their jumping worm management activities in order to inform future scientific research and empower others impacted by jumping worms. And so in 2020, we had a lot of gardeners and volunteers that did a bunch of different stuff to try to manage jumping worms on their property. And they tried a bunch of things. They monitored the environmental impacts of jumping worms. They offered potential research management recommendations. And then it became clear that there was a need for emotional support and additional research resources. And so then over the first pandemic winter of 2020 to 2021, the Minnesota Master Naturalist trainees helped me do a lit review on the emotional impacts of jumping worms. Yeah, that doesn't exist in the literature. So we had to expand and look at the emotional impacts of climate change. And so then in 2021, I added information about solastalgia. So that is essentially the mourning for a place that has changed. So if you grew up on a farm and that farm has been turned into a Walmart, you might experience solastalgia. Similarly, if you spent your childhoods at a lovely cabin on a lake in northern Minnesota, and now that cabin and that lake are negatively impacted by zebra mussels, and you can no longer comfortably walk barefoot in the water, you might experience solastalgia. Serious leisure is when you do something and you're very serious about it. So think of like a master gardener, and all of a sudden you feel as if you aren't very good at it. So you've brought jumping worms to your property and you've degraded the gardening value, and now it has really impacted your self-image. And disenfranchised grief is a type of grief where they don't have rituals for it. It's not recognized. I like to sometimes think that when I ask someone like at the farmer's market or a plant sale about jumping worms, and I get the crazy lady look, right? The people are not recognizing that this is a concern for me, and there's just sort of no cultural space for that. So if you get the crazy lady look, like red flag should go off. But there are ways you can deal with that. There are some ways you can ritualize this. There is some hope and agency even by participating in this project. And there are always benefits from being outside for humans. So just being outside and getting your hands dirty is beneficial. So now I want to just sort of say the quick high level summary. This I will drop into the chat later. This is the full report. This came out only a few weeks ago, but it turns out by 2021, after 2 years of data had come in, almost all of our volunteers reported a reduction in jumping worm numbers. And I think really what's happening is creative integrated pest management does seem to offer promise for jumping worm reductions within the home landscape. So there's no silver bullet, but if you're just kind of plug along at it, you can reduce the numbers and thus the impact. We don't have any similarly encouraging data for forests yet. And then there was that research void about the emotional impact. So we did do a survey of our volunteers to look at the emotions, and it turns out that they are very real. So jumping worms cause a lot of sadness, fear, panic, impatience, anger, and increased negative thoughts and tears. But by participating in this project, participants' feelings became more positive, reducing worry and increasing confidence. They increased their attention to environmental change and their jumping worm outreach efforts. So it turns out just by that having hope and agency that what you're doing can make a difference actually improved people's emotions. And then a few last findings. So even when jumping worm management costs money and take time, respondents reported a very sharp increase in the efforts to manage jumping worms. And so, sometimes when I think about the green industry being very concerned that people won't buy their products, I actually suspect people are buying many things and new plants. They're just buying different things with a different goal and a different frame. So finally, and then as communicators, so as Pest First Detectors, we must manage the stories and actions we talk about, because those also cause anxiety, mourning, anger, hopelessness, and potentially motivation. So we just need to manage the message. I want to say my respondents, median age 57, 92% white, and 88% women. So this is that same information in a chart. We're going to sort of skip through this. I've already told you. Here is this negative thoughts. And then have you ever cried? I mean, so these are really, really real things. So finally, I'm going to close with, I see my time is ticking by. So please share with everyone, don't buy worms. Don't buy jumping worms. You can indeed buy them online. Don't do that. Don't move invasive species. Anglers dispose of unwanted bait in the trash. So don't dump your worms on the lake shore or the river side. And then gardeners be on the lookout for jumping worms in soil, potted landscape plants, compost, and mulch. And then vermiculture, so those that use worms to do composting, please know how to identify worms. Again, typically vermiculturists use red wiggler worms, but we know that jumping worms have been, I think, inadvertently included in those red wiggler purchases. And as with all invasive species are a threat. You can help with prevention, early detection, rapid response management, and be careful with your communications, because around jumping worms, it is particularly sensitive. Whew. So with that, I hope I have time for questions. I see there's been chatter in the chat, so I'm going to stop sharing for now and field questions as they come in.
Great. Well, thanks, Angie. Really great overview of jumping worms, and I love how you kind of link the people to them as well with all your work and the literature review that you did on some of the social impacts and human impacts of these worms too. We've got a lot of questions in chat. Again, if you have a question, type it into chat and we can relay it to Angie. I guess the first one, Angie, Sharon asks, nothing will grow under my bird feeders and the soil there is somewhat coffee ground looking. Can birds carry the eggs? And then a second question, do the jumping worms have any predators?
Yes, excellent. So I don't know, I have not heard of any examples where birds carry the eggs. We do know that birds do seem to feed on the worms. So they're very close to the surface. So I was actually, just on Friday, I went to go sample at someone's house and they were talking about, and she lives adjacent to a golf course. I said, do you know if the golf course has jumping worms? She said, I don't. But we did notice that a huge flock of robins landed on the golf course, and we now wonder if they were feeding on jumping worms. And she had had that experience in her yard only a couple years earlier when she first discovered jumping worms. The answer to the predator question is yes, absolutely. It turns out many things eat jumping worms, and to some wildlife, they frankly might be a boon. So that same gardener is a part of my project, and she reported a sharp increase in some amphibians. And so we think that, frankly, they were eating the worms. We know that turkeys feed on worms, chicken feed on worms. There seem to be many wild birds that feed on worms, on jumping worms specifically. Again, they are living very close to the soil surface. They're very easy. I mean, the soil is already sort of changed and easier to access. So the question has been, I mean, so some of our volunteers are frankly trying to bait wildlife into eating their worms, and they seem to have a little bit of success getting the worms baited and eaten. What is far less clear is if they're actually reducing the worm population in any meaningful way. So it's an interesting approach, right? And that's where I would also sort of remind you about bioaccumulation. So if you think there might be reason to worry about bioaccumulation on your property, it might be worth knowing that before you try to bait a bunch of birds.
Very interesting. Another question from Tom. We often think about using boot brushes, especially when it relates to invasive species. Tom asks, is a boot brush station at the edge of a wooded site enough to stop the spread of worms into the woods?
Yeah, enough. I don't know. I would say make sure you leave clean, right? So I always carry boot brushes. They're in the side of every door in my car, and I try desperately to make everyone that gets into my car use them. But we do know from the Arboretum, Erin at the Arboretum did empty out her boot brush station, and she was able to grow out worms. So I think there is this preliminary anecdotal evidence that indeed jumping worm eggs can get captured in those boot brushes, and so then that can reduce the spread. So absolutely use those for sure. And of course, they're frankly very similar in size to things like garlic mustard seed, right? So the same methods that can reduce the spread of seeds should work to reduce the spread of jumping worms. So please do use your boot brushes diligently. And I will say, related to shoes and tools, I think all of the gardeners that I know that know they have jumping worms now just have dedicated, gardening shoes and dedicated tools that simply don't leave their property. So I have an old pair of tennies, and that's the pair that I garden in. And when I walk to volunteer in my local woodlot, I have a whole different set of shoes that I use to do that, so that I'm not tracking from my garden to the woodlot.
Great. And Angie, you talked about there being no native earthworms in Minnesota. And Nick is asking about, with their active jumping nature, is the rate of spread of jumping worms faster than some of the other non-native earthworms that we have?
Yeah, much, much faster. And I can never remember exactly how much faster, but, typically we talk about worms spreading by the meter or the yard, that's the sort of the scale that we use. And frankly, it's closer to tens or hundreds of meters with jumping worms. And they are more active. We also think that erosion helps to move them downhill, right? So if you get jumping worms at the top of the hill, the eggs and the worms, like gravity will move them down. We also know, I mean, surprisingly, frankly, so Lee Freilich is working at the Arboretum and doing a jumping worm project, and the Arboretum has had jumping worms for a while, and they got a big load of what they believe to be worm-free mulch, so wood mulch delivered to the Arboretum. And an easy way to assume that it's wood-free or worm-free is if trees are cut and immediately chipped, and the chipped into the chipping van, and then the chipping van drops them at the property. So there's no way for them to get contaminated on the soil, right? Worms don't actually live in trees. So that type of material is dropped at the Arboretum in the middle of the paved parking lot to prevent getting jumping worms into it. And within a week, jumping worms had invaded that mulched pile, and so they had clearly been able to get across the paved parking lot to the mulch pile and survive. And then they realized that they were moving from one side of the mulch pile to the other to find the comfortable temperature, right? And so that really speaks to like how quickly they can move, and it is quite surprising. And we don't know how they like sniffed it out. I mean, we don't know how they knew that mulch pile was there, but clearly they did.
Very good. Janet asks, it's time, a lot of organizations are having plant sales as spring is emerging. And so Janet asks, as a home gardener, what should I do if I want to purchase plants? For example, I need to buy shrubs to landscape my home. Should I get rid of the soil and rinse the plant as they are doing at the Master Gardener plant sales?
Yeah, I think that's good practice. So first, I would say that you're the customer. And so if you're going to buy plants and you don't have jumping worms, you're trying to prevent them from coming into your landscape, you should ask the seller what they're doing about jumping worm management. And if you get the crazy lady look, then that is not a comfortable place, right? They maybe don't know about jumping worms. You can take this as an education opportunity, but it means they haven't been trying to mitigate the risk. And so frankly, I would not recommend that. If you ask about jumping worms and you get a full and robust answer that you feel comfortable with, then that's probably as good as it can get. Now, if you want to get back to your site and look, so what I recommend is look for any evidence of jumping worms. So look for worms themselves and identify them. Look, the eggs are really hard to see, but you could look for them, but also look for that coffee ground texture. And if you see anything that worries you, absolutely, you want to get rid of the soil, you want to dip it in water, and you want to do your best to make sure that you don't spread it. And I will be frank, I have totally purchased plants and got home and found a worm on them. It was not jumping worms, but I have a presentation in which that picture is included, right? So these things happen, but I think a lot of plant sales in Minnesota are becoming more aware. So if you ask a question and you get a good answer, that maybe is as good as it's going to get for right now.
Very good. Nick has a really good question, I think, in talking about, Minnesota has long talked about the problem with European earthworms, and especially you mentioned the relationships with deer, and you cited some other studies in that area. So Nick asks, have the concerns for jumping worms' ecological impacts supplanted existing concerns for European earthworms? For example, have we given up on one earthworm and kind of focusing on another?
Yeah, it is a great question. And I would say, I don't think we've given up, but it is an interesting phenomenon. So there's some research out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison that tried to assess like which was worse, right? So they did it at the Madison Arboretum, and the Madison Arboretum already had Eurasian earthworms. So it wasn't like there was a control without earthworms. Like all the sites had worms. But then they also had an infestation of jumping worms. And so within, I think it was 3 years of their research, they went from having only jumping worms in a small area to jumping worms throughout the entire forest. And then they saw this absolute reduction in extirpation of all the other Eurasian earthworms. So that was super interesting. And this significant increase in jumping worm density and total worm density because of jumping worms. But interestingly, they didn't necessarily prove that jumping worms were worse for the forest. So the hypothesis was that they would cause more trouble during drought scenarios because there was even less leaf litter, right? And it turns out that wasn't the case. So the impacts might be different, but we're not entirely sure they're worse. right? They're different. And I have to say, sometimes I have these moments where I'm being particularly optimistic and I think, wow, if you get a site that has jumping worms and it gets rid of all of the other earthworms in that forest system, and then we figure out how to get rid of jumping worms, can we actually get rid of worms, right? Do we essentially have a biocontrol and then we kill the biocontrol? And ooh, that would be so exciting. The problem is nothing that we have sort of found that seems to work for urban and yard landscapes, and that integrated pest management approach looks even remotely promising to upscale to a forested system. I mean, the forests are just such larger systems and they're managed less intensively. So I don't know that we've sort of entirely switched our focus. We're still learning about that, but some days I think there might be hope there. I would like to think that, at least.
Good. Well, we're getting near the end. A couple more questions before we'll have to close. And I will paste in just in a moment a link to the evaluation, a link to the CFE credits if you're looking for that. So be on the lookout for that. I guess Rick Dahlman mentions his daughter has a phobia to worms. She becomes fearful seeing just one worm. And it looks like the rest got cut off. I don't know if you had any comments on that, Angie.
Yeah, so those emotional impacts, and I'll just say what I'd like, just really briefly, the first year that we started having volunteers really becoming very emotional about jumping worms, they were like running out and buying things that were inappropriate, and just there was a real sense of panic, right? And this was our tip off. And then during the first year of the pandemic, so I will concede that the pandemic had everyone stressed out very legitimately all by itself. But I was getting extraordinary number of calls of people crying on the phone about jumping worms, right? And I'm a forester, like I am not a therapist. This felt very outside of my scope. But it turns out that jumping worms really do impact people in, I think, surprising ways. And it's possible that other invasive species do, and it just wasn't as acute and so quite as obvious. But um, I don't know that she's alone. I mean, the other thing is that question is there, I think almost 20% of respondents have dreamt of jumping worms, which really speaks to it's like, seeping into our psyche. So, and I want to share that because people really, I think part of that emotional impact is they feel like it's just them, like they're the crazy person. And so I try to be really clear that, nope, this is a common response. Like you are normal and it'll be okay. And then that people actually reached out with a lot of gratitude when I started adding those emotional pieces to our project, because I do think they really felt isolated, and it's not true. They're not alone.
Mm-hmm. Good. And then there's about 3 questions. I kind of had the same theme about nurseries and kind of what they're doing. Are you aware of any educational programs that are targeting nurseries, Angie? And then maybe specifically the mulch. Are they any actions being taken to like heat treat the mulch to make their mulch safe for public consumption?
Yeah. So I want to say that the Minnesota MNLA, Minnesota Landscape Nursery and Landscape Association, Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association, put out a jumping worm informational sheet to their members. It is a member-based organization. About was it maybe 6 or 8 months ago now, and I was able to see it, and I thought it was exceptionally well done. It was frank and honest, and it talked about the risks and the problems and some ways to try to approach management and mitigation. It is not publicly available. It is a membership organization, and it is just for their members, which I understand completely, but I'm a little sad I can't share it because I thought it was really quite good. I do know that at least one nursery here in Rochester has admitted they have jumping worms, and they have been really proactive to try to mitigate the risk and manage the jumping worms on their site. And I think as consumers, we should potentially reward honesty. Right. I mean, so unlike some others, I mean, we do not want to ostracize people that are working really hard to mitigate the risk and then patronize people that might have their head buried in the sand. Because I do think we want to be really clear that that knowing about the problem and trying to mitigate the risk is the most responsible approach. And so I think we need to just work with those people that are working to mitigate the risk. And that's the best we can do. And I think about it now as I think about whether I decide if I'm going to go to an event or wear a mask or allow my family to go to an event, right? And so throughout the pandemic, we've had to have all of these different ways to think about risk. Were we high risk? Did I have a vaccine? Had I had my booster? You know, who am I with? Am I going to see grandma and grandpa soon? And every time we make that decision, we have to use the metrics that matter at the moment. But ultimately, many of us made decisions to go out into public, you know, using these risk mitigation efforts. And I think it's the same for jumping worms. So I was more likely to go and patronize a location that required masks if I was worried about COVID than not. And I think we need to offer the same to the green industry. And so I want to say in Minnesota, they have been working. It's within their individual members, and each member is making a decision whether to state if they have it and how they're mitigating the risk. But as consumers, I absolutely think you should ask. So I know it's 10 o'clock, 10:01. I'm going to talk about the mulch for a moment. So right now, there are no certifications for mulch, but the North American Invasive Species Management Association is working to do weed-free certification. They have it for a few things. And I have continuously said, if you're willing to include jumping worms, I will continue to serve on the committee. And we have a meeting yet tomorrow. So they haven't dumped me from the committee. And so what I keep saying is the ways that you make things weed-free are often very similar to how you make them worm free. And they're probably not going to use that term free because it's really fraught for trouble. But I do think the North American Invasive Species Management Association is likely to have products, including mulch, that may have a level of certification that can cause you to be more confident that they are worm free. And so fingers are crossed. And I think they're hoping to get that done within a year to a year and a half.
Very good. Angie, we do have two more questions if you have time to answer.
I'm
those.
happy to stay if people are willing. So we have a lot of people here. So go ahead, Matt.
Sounds good. Yeah, and if you do have to go, by all means, we don't mean to keep you, but we do have at least two more questions to get through. Asha asks, looks like their son is interested in learning about jumping worms. It's for a scout project and for some science projects. Wondering, how do we get access to the worms to learn about them? And for reference, he's in high school. So any thoughts on that, Angie?
So yeah, and I don't know where she is, but I feel like that request has come through my inbox even as close as yesterday. And I was under the impression that you were working with Ryan up in UMD, but if not, circle back to me. I do have an idea. And so maybe just send me an email and I will drop it into the link and I'll take that offline because that has been bouncing through my inbox a couple of times.
Very good. And then Nick asks, you know, it used to be you could do mustard solution treatments for the non-native earthworms, and that's used for sampling. Is there a potential control avenue with that substance as well for jumping worms, or are there likely impacts to other soil, macro, microfauna from using that mustard solution and soaking it in the soil?
Yeah, excellent question. And so the answer is we do not recommend that you use the mustard solution. So it's mustard powder and water that is commonly used for soil for sampling for worms in general. And we don't recommend it as management. I will say at least one of our volunteers in the report management project just spread mustard powder dry on the soil and reported, you know, that the jumping worms seemed to be decreased. There were several other things that were done kind of at the same time, so it's hard to isolate one from another. And your question about other microorganism impact is a great one. So I asked that question. I'll be frank, I don't think a lot of people know how to identify or understand the microorganisms in the soil. So we have very little data about that. And I think it's a good question. That is the type of question that Lee Freilich is working on in his research. Now, I don't know that he's looking at mustard powder particularly, but some of the other chemicals that he is looking at, he's looking at the unintended consequences of those use. So at this point, we do not recommend that as a source of management. And we also do not recommend the mustard dip, like to try to clean your plants, let's say, if you buy them at the farmer's market or at a garden supply store. We just recommend water as your dip. But I do hear the question. And so at least one other volunteer was experimenting with that.
Very good. And then Rick made a comment that saying wood that is chipped, going back to mulching and wood that is chipped directly into a van may be contaminated with worms because trees that are cut down and directly chipped will have parts that hit or lay on the ground prior to chipping, so that chips may still be suspect. So I don't know if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, it's a fair point, right? So I will admit that a company called Chip Drop, an organization rather, delivered chips to my place, and I have jumpy worms. I had them. I was kind of getting desperate to figure out what to do, and I think that in the grand scheme of risk, it's really fairly low, right? So at least in my neighborhood, the way this typically works is their arborists, because I'm in town, they go out to a site. They might touch the ground, but it takes. I mean, worms don't eat whole logs typically. I mean, I think they do well in mulch in part because it's smaller, it's warmer. A lot of those trees do pretty quickly go from the sawyer, or they're getting delimbed by climbers. They're touching the ground, and then they're very quickly being thrown into the chipper. And so, do they touch the ground? Yes. Is there enough time for contamination? I think the short answer is not really. And I'll be honest, I have not seen these guys like necessarily rake up those small chips and throw them in, right? I don't really see that happening very much. But is it possible? Yeah, it's like, I feel like always possible. You know, could they have put something else in that van in before? Possibly. But I think in the grand scheme of chips, those are probably some of your least risky chips because they do go directly from the van. As soon as those chips get dumped out of the van and let's say piled, so in Rochester, there are literally chip piles that I can just go and collect and put in my car and take away. If the soil around that pile is contaminated, it should be a gigantic red flag. If the soil is not contaminated, if you don't have jumping worms on site, then that's probably fine.
And then maybe one final question from Sharon about cedar chips. Are the cedar chips less hospitable to the worms? And do cedar chips prohibit plant growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we haven't seen any data to support that they aren't. I don't know that I've had a volunteer use cedar chips specifically. So I did have a volunteer use white pine needles. So like needle, a pine mulch, is you see that commonly in the South, didn't impact, I mean, jumping worms didn't seem to care. A volunteer used coca, so chocolate husks, which is a different kind of mulch that you can buy to put that down, see if that mattered. It turns out jumping worms moved in. It didn't seem to impact them. I will say that a couple of volunteers experimented with cocoa mulch, and so that's in my report. And indeed, cocoa, so made from coconut husks, jumping worms do appear to disappear. They are not present when coconut husk mulch is used. And so that has, in my opinion, actually quite a bit of promise. So the University of Minnesota Arboretum is going to test that in a public garden for me this summer and see if they experience the same thing. And several volunteers tested it last year and are testing it hopefully again this year.
And then what about black walnut chips? Do you want to suggest refrain using those given the problems with black walnut and growing things, or?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I haven't had anybody specifically use black walnut only mulch chips. So black walnut is allelopathic, so it produces a chemical in its root system that can restrict the growth of other plants below those. I actually don't know that chemical. I think I read a paper not long ago that it doesn't actually persist in the environment very long. So if you kill a black walnut, it's within like a year that I think that characteristic goes away. So I suspect the wood itself doesn't hold it, so it wouldn't matter. And in the mulch that I received from my chip drop, there was black walnut in it, and the worms ate all of it just fine. But what I will say was really surprising for me is one of my volunteers reported and had a picture, and she actually reported that worms seem to hang out in the black walnut husks of nuts. And so sure enough, she had a picture of a jumping worm emerging right out of a husked black walnut. And I have no idea what that is about, right? I don't know what's in those husks. I mean, they're black, or they're, leave a messy brown stain everywhere. But boy, they do not seem to bother jumping worms.
Great. Well, I think we managed to get through all of those questions. Thanks, Angie. Those were some great questions and a lot of details in many of them. So let's go ahead and give Angie a virtual round of applause. Thanks, Angie, for all your knowledge on jumping worms, and really great, really timely topic with spring coming online and people being able to start looking for these. So thanks all for joining us here today. A couple of reminders: if you go up to gosh, what time was it? It was 10:03 where I posted the short evaluation. Again, this is the last session that we have in this webinar series. And I think Angie is always thinking ahead, so wondering what we can do in the future. There is a spot there in the comments. I think it's the very last question about future things that you might want offered. So we encourage you, if there are other topics related to forest pests, whether it be jumping worms or something else that's on your mind, we encourage you to put that in there and let us know what you're interested in learning about. That's a good way for us to know, to make sure that we're providing the best content to you all. So with that, I think we'll close. I don't know, Angie, any final words of wisdom?
No, thank you everybody so much for joining us and staying late. And like maybe final words of wisdom. So do share the word about jumping worm, and again, kind of don't be too panic inducing, right? Remind them that the world is not going to end, but prevention is indeed the best type of management, way easier than everything else. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and have a great Tuesday.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We'll sign off.